Thank you for that introduction, Ines, and thank you everybody for coming along this afternoon to my talk. As Ines said, I've been investigating the paranormal for quite a few years, and I'm beginning to notice that the audience is getting younger and younger, although maybe I'm getting older and older. I've selected certain things which have particularly intrigued me over the years. You know, I've always been fascinated by that interaction between things that seem quite normal, can have a normal explanation, but things that, on the other hand, could be supernatural, which maybe have an explanation which is completely out of the ordinary and, you know, almost impossible to believe. So I've just selected a few things which over the years have particularly excited my interest, and things which I just wondered, you know, what is the explanation for these? And I'm going to take a look at vampires and ghouls. What is the difference between a vampire and a ghoul? A very good question. A vampire, probably, you could say, is one of the living dead, looks like an ordinary human being. A ghoul is somebody or something that has come up out of the ground, out of the grave, and doesn't look particularly attractive. So what's the connection between that and Resurrection Man? Now you might remember or have read about Resurrection Men, people who were supposedly digging dead bodies out of graves and taking them away for dissection. And there's just a standard 18th, 19th century graveyard, St. Cuthbert's in Edinburgh. So, pointing the wrong way. But what is odd about some of these old graveyards is that watchtowers were built because people at the end of the 18th and into the early 19th century were getting concerned that bodies of their loved ones were being dug up and taken away. And in some places, this is in Persia, put these mortsafes in, mortsafe in, which was supposed to protect the body from these grave robbers. There's not many left these days, but there's 2 or 3 up in this site in Persia. And the idea was that this would actually prevent somebody coming along and digging up a body. Because there was a kind of panic about it, because people felt, you know, that there was no explanation as to why bodies were disappearing from graves. So who was responsible for removing dead bodies? Well, the medical profession got the blame because it was believed that the medical profession needed bodies for dissection. It wasn't actually, they were restricted the number of bodies they could use. So the answer was to go and dig up dead bodies. And people like William Burke and William Hare, I'm sure you've heard about, they were 2 of the most notorious resurrection men. And the thing is, Burke and Hare weren't actually going around digging up dead bodies. They were actually murdering people. And this is where the whole thing becomes quite strange. Because there was a genuine panic, as you've seen from the mortsafes and the watchtowers, that people were digging up bodies. In fact, these grave diggers were supposed to be so expert at what they were doing. You know, they were digging, even though there were people watching and patrolling, they managed to dig up these bodies and disappear with them. So Burke and Hare, though they are called resurrection men, supposedly digging up bodies, weren't in fact really resurrection men, they were murderers. And I've always asked myself, there was this strange phenomenon, bodies were disappearing. You know, why would the medical profession want to dig up dead bodies? I mean, if you look back at the situation in the 18th and early 19th centuries, you know, there wasn't the same scrutiny of people as there is today. There wasn't the same kind of bureaucracy. Nobody was constantly filling in forms. You know, there was no kind of proper, what you like, secret state, keeping an eye on everybody. In fact, there were thousands and thousands of people or known people dying as paupers. So, and some of these bodies were used for dissection. So there was certainly, if you like, if I could be crude, a kind of ready harvest of bodies lying about which the medical profession could use. So did they really need to go and dig up dead bodies? So what is the explanation? Right. One of the explanations, of course, has been that we're talking about a vampire phenomenon. And this is the thing I've always found particularly interesting, is that, you get the impression that vampirism was based in Eastern Europe. And that is actually far from being the case, because Scotland had a long reputation as a place where vampires existed. And you often get the reference of Bram Stoker and Slains Castle in Aberdeenshire, which Bram Stoker did visit, and he did collect folk stories from it. And one of the suggestions has always been that Bram Stoker was so inspired by Slains Castle that it encouraged him to write Dracula. I've investigated and I've read some stuff that Bram Stoker wrote. That's in the National Library in Scotland. But I've never seen actually anything which directly links him to Slains Castle. Now this is Slains Castle in 1925, and if you've been there ever since, you notice practically a ruin, which gives it a more foreboding appearance. But that's what it looked like at the time that Bram Stoker would have visited it. So it's possible that Bram Stoker picked up on tales of vampires which actually were in various parts of Scotland. And you can look at cases in Scotland from over 500 years ago. I mean, I know we've got some people from Dumfriesshire here. Down in Annan, there was a tale that a person, looked strange, was wandering around Annan High Street. He was actually attacking people and sucking their blood. And when they eventually tracked it down and opened up this shallow grave, they found this corpse with blood running from his mouth. So they said, this is the man who must be this vampire. I don't know whether they called him a vampire, but we call him a vampire. So they chopped up his body and burnt it, which is a classic way of getting rid of vampires. And there are a lot of other cases. I mean, there's one which seems particularly strange, where a woman whose fiancé had died decided that she wanted to be buried with her fiancé even though she was alive. So, according to this tale, they went along with it, they buried her, and then, some weeks later, they saw this woman wandering about dressed in white. And it was the woman who had been buried with fangs. It looked like she was out looking for people to attack. So, whether or not these stories were actually true or not, there certainly was a tradition of vampirism in Scotland. And I'll come back to some more recent cases. I say recent, this dates from the 17th century, but it's kind of in a period where there was a fair lot of recording of events. And this relates to a man called Philip Stansfield, who was accused of killing his father, Sir James Stansfield, in very strange circumstances. Circumstances which kind of gave rise to the suggestion that Stansfield had been a vampire, or that his son thought he'd been a vampire. And this incident took place in East Lothian, just outside Edinburgh. And according to this particular account, I've just photocopied the page of the kind of pamphlet which described the events. Now, Philip Stansfield, his name's spelled different ways, so I'll get it a bit mixed up. I'm going to call it Stansfield because it's easier to say. Philip Stansfield was seen floating in a river in East Lothian, and his son, Philip, was seen standing watching him go by, making no effort to try and save him. So somebody else who worked on the estate, because Stansfield owned an estate, they went out and pulled in Stansfield. He was dead. It looked like he'd been drowned. So they took him to an outhouse on the estate, left the body there. Philip, his son, meanwhile, disappeared into the house and started burning a lot of papers and books that Stansfield had. He had quite an extensive library. And he was acting in a very strange way. In the evening, Philip went to the place, the outhouse where the body was, and he actually took it away in the middle of the night and buried it in the local churchyard. Well, this was all very, very strange behaviour. And because it was quite a prominent family, it got back to the authorities in Edinburgh, and they began to investigate the circumstances surrounding the case, believing that Philip had actually murdered his father. So they did this traditional way of detecting a murderer at the time, and that was to get Philip to touch the corpse of his father, which they'd now dug up and put in the local church. So when Philip went up and touched his father, blood started pouring out of Sir James's mouth and various other parts of his body. And the immediate conclusion was that Philip had murdered his father. However, of course, news of this got out pretty quickly, and people began to suspect that Sir James had maybe been a vampire. Now, there was no evidence that Sir Philip had been out attacking anybody or sucking anybody's blood. But because of this blood flow, and because it looked like he'd actually been alive and was supposed to be dead, then this suggestion that Sir James might have been a vampire, and this is the reason why Philip had actually deliberately killed him and tried to bury the body. This is a suggestion. And Philip himself died in a very strange way. He was put on trial, then executed, but they refused to let his relations bury his body. And a few days later, Philip himself was found floating in a nearby pond, which is kind of very strange echo of what happened to Sir James, which again maybe reinforced the suggestion that here we had Sir James, a vampire, and Philip, his son, and maybe he was a vampire too. And one of the ways of obviously getting rid of vampires was to put them into running water. That was a tradition, as well as cutting up and burning the whole body. Yes, Sir James Stansfield, murder victim or vampire. And even to a more recent case, right into the 19th century, Willie Christie Miller, vampire or eccentric. Now, Willie Christie Miller, he came from a wealthy family, but he was known to be a very eccentric kind of individual. He was described as looking very odd, thin, spindly, somebody who kept himself to himself, and it was known that he had a very large library, including a lot of occult books. But the biggest mystery occurred when he died, because he had this tomb built for himself. Before he died, obviously, he had it prepared, and then in his will, he insisted that he be buried 40 feet down in a lead coffin and a big stone slab put on top of it. And he said that he must be buried at night and not during the day. And also that he was not to be buried in a church. He wanted to be buried on non-church ground. And this monument actually sits today in Craigentinney, in Edinburgh. It's surrounded by houses, but at the time it was put up, it was in more or less empty fields. And you can see also from the side there, maybe that's better actually, some scenes from ancient Egypt, Pharaoh in a chariot, which reflected his apparent interest in Egyptology. Of course, because he'd been buried in such an eccentric way, people began to think he had some kind of secret to hide, that he felt or believed himself to be a vampire, and he did not want to rise again from the grave. Nearly 100 years later, a policeman passing by saw that the door to the monument was open. You can't actually get into it today, it's got a big iron fence around it. So you can't actually get into the bit, but you can stand quite close to it. So he went in to investigate. What did he see? He said he saw a figure moving about inside the monument. And being a not very brave policeman, he immediately slammed the door shut and ran away. And there was no further investigation taking place. But of course, rumours circulated. And once again, the belief was, did we have really Christian? Had he escaped from his coffin? Was he ready to roam around the countryside attacking people? And I'd like to link this, it might not seem like an obvious connection, I'd like to link this issue of ghouls and vampires and people disappearing from graves with more recent strange vanishings, people who suddenly disappear. So, why do people disappear and where do they go to? I might say that practically every day people vanish, and we know that some of them most of them are found, but some of them never come back again. So where do they go? There's some strange cases now, which I'll run through. Peter Gibbs, EYNHALLOW in Ireland, FARNARIO, age 70 case, but Gary doesn't mind. Fairy tales. Here we have a very weird case. Peter Gibbs. He disappeared at 9:30 p.m. on the 24th of December 1975. Now, Peter Gibbs was the director of the Scottish National Orchestra in 1975, and he was visiting the island of Mull. He was hoping to buy a property of some kind, so he had been travelling around trying to find a suitable place. I think he was trying to take over a hotel or something like that. There's Peter Gibbs, looking pretty youthful, obviously wasn't 55 when that photo was taken. I'm sure we'd all like to look like that at 55. And he hired a Cessna plane to fly about the islands. Just go back. So on Christmas Eve, he was actually at the Glen Forster Hotel, which you might just be able to see on the side there, having a meal with his girlfriend, and then suddenly, at 9:30, or just before 9:30, he decided he wanted to do a night flight. Now, he wasn't a particularly experienced pilot or anything, but he just suddenly announced, I'm going to get up the plane and fly. And that is the airstrip, which, as you can see, is just basically a piece of flat land. It was really weird because there was no lights there. You know, obviously there was no tower or anything. It was just a flat piece of land, which, you know, you couldn't land and take off on. But at night, there was no guidance system. So off he went in his Cessna. Off he went and disappeared into the night. So, of course, eventually, the authorities were alerted. There was no sign of the plane, and for the next 4 months, there were regular searches to try and find the Cessna and Peter Gibbs. But there was absolutely no sign of him, just looked like he completely disappeared. So that was December the 24th. On the 14th of April, 4 months later, about 4 months later, a shepherd walking on a hill spotted this body lying over a tree trunk. It was Peter Gibbs. And this is an area that had been searched quite thoroughly several times. And the body was undamaged. I mean, you know, He certainly hadn't fallen from a plane, and there was no sign of the plane itself. So where on earth had he been for those 4 months? This is a mystery that has absolutely never been solved. The Cessna, several years later, the Cessna was discovered in the water off Mull, which raised the question of how on earth that Peter Gibbs got from that plane up the hill. And even if he had, why hadn't his body been seen before? So was there another explanation? Well, when Peter Gibbs flew up from Mull, strange lights were seen in the sky, what they call fairy lights, but others have been suggested could be UFOs. So, then came the speculation. Had Peter Gibbs been abducted by an alien? Was that one explanation for it? Or had he flown into another dimension? You know, had something strange happened to him? Is this why he vanished and suddenly reappeared, you know, untouched? As if he just stepped out of the plane rather than fallen or been in a crash? So that was one strange vanishing which I must say interested me. Another one took place even more recently, 14th July 1990, which you may have read about. A trip was organised to the island of EYNHALLOW. You can't actually get a regular boat there, so once or twice a year you can get on a trip that takes you there. And on that particular date, because it was going on a proper ship, and they had to check in the number of people who were getting on board, so the crew counted 80 people on board. We went out to the island of EYNHALLOW, had a look round. It's some kind of spot for seeing, you know, birds and seals or something, and other stuff. All the tourists, the trippers, got back on the boat, went back to Orkney, counted the people coming up, and 2 people were missing. 80 had supposedly gone out, only 78 came back. So immediately, of course, there was concern. What happened? Had they left 2 people behind? So back they went to the island. The authorities again were informed, and a thorough search was conducted of the island, including helicopters and lifeguards, and there was a thorough look at it taken, and the police were involved, and it hit the newspapers. And there was some speculation about what happened to these people. One obvious thing was, had they miscounted the number of people going on? And the crew said no way, because they were used to taking people, so they knew perfectly well how to make sure that the number of people who came on were properly recorded and so on. And it even went international, because they thought maybe these were 2 tourists and nobody knew where they were, who they were, so they inquired as far away as Germany and France and places like that, just to see if there was anybody knew or any idea who these people were. And again, the story just kind of faded from the newspaper, and these 2 people were never found. The strange thing is that EYNHALLOW, in fact, did have a reputation as a supernatural place. It was known as a vanishing island, an island which could appear and disappear. And there was suggestion that maybe there was some kind of strange energy force, or there was some area where you could step into another dimension. And this was maybe one of the reasons why, these 2 tourists, or these 2 people, had disappeared. Or did they just have a perfectly ordinary explanation? The Flannan Isles, 15th December 1900. There's a film just recently come out about it, which I haven't as yet seen. But again, it's all going into all the details of it, but as I'm sure you're aware, it was a famous case where 3 White House keepers disappeared. I'm not sure if these are the White House keepers. I did actually get this on the internet, and it claimed it was the 3 White House keepers. But basically what happened was a ship passing by on the 15th December noticed that the FARNARIO lighthouse wasn't working. And obviously people were sent out to check to see what was going on, what the problem was. And when they got to the lighthouse, they discovered that the lighthouse keepers weren't there, had vanished. But everything looked normal. It didn't look as if there'd been any particular problem or anything. The lighthouse was ready to go. No signs of a fight or suggestions that lighthouse keepers had maybe had a dispute between themselves and killed each other or something weird like that. So what was the suggested answer? Well, there had been a lot of storms round about that time, because obviously the lighthouse keepers were expected to keep a daily log as one of the duties, but the log on the FARNARIO lighthouse finished on 15th December, which was the same day a ship had passed by and seen there was no light. And there had been a lot of storms leading up to the 15th December. So the suggestion was that the lighthouse keepers had gone down to the quay, it was 70 feet walk down to the quay, and that they got washed away by a wave or some problem had arisen and they'd all fallen into the sea. The only problem with that is that it was part of the regulations that the lighthouse keepers, at least one of them, was staying in the lighthouse. If somebody went down to the quay to take on provisions or check over things or sort things, at least one of them had to stay in the lighthouse. There was always somebody there. So why would 3 of them go down in bad weather? I mean, it just seemed contrary to common sense, contrary to regulations and contrary to common sense. But they couldn't come up with any particular answer. Now, I've read one or two things about this, and one writer suggested that these were lazy people, lazy lighthouse keepers who had a bad reputation. Marshall, Duckett and MacArthur, the lighthouse keepers. But actually, I've read some of the reports of the period, and in fact these 3 lighthouse men were very experienced, and they had a good reputation. And that was one of the reasons why they'd been chosen, which suggests that they would not have split up. 2 of them had gone down, one of them would have stayed up. So, even if 2 of them had been washed away, there would have been somebody there. So where did they vanish to? Again, the FARNARIO had a reputation as a place where there was a lot of ghostly activity, a kind of paranormal place. And once again, you get this suggestion: was it some kind of interdimensional contact? Was it an alien abduction? Was it something weird? I mean, was there a weird interaction between this world and other worlds beyond? Or was it a straightforward explanation? I know Gary's here today. Sorry, Gary. I know you didn't vanish and disappear, but I just use this as an example of, modern cases, right up to date, where people say they've had abduction experiences, they've been taken away, they've gone away, for hours or maybe days, but they return. And the point I'm just making there is, what if people disappeared like that? What if Gary hadn't come back, for example? That would be another case of a strange disappearance, or somebody being abducted by aliens, come back, days later, dead or whatever. I mean, that is just another, if you like, example of the kind of thing that maybe has gone on. And this kind of disappearance of people has been going on for a long, long time, because, if you look back to the old fairy tales, fairy traditions, you get many, many stories of people who claim that they've been abducted by the fairies, they've been taken underground for days, or for even longer periods. And probably one of the best documented, if you like, cases of these was done by Robert Kirk back in the 17th century, Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Falls and Fairies. And he himself allegedly disappeared, or he claimed that he disappeared and abducted by the fairies. So, although there's some dispute about it, of course, he does have a grave in Kirk at Aberfoyle. But he was supposed to have been abducted by the fairies. And who knows how many strange vanishings have taken place, of which we are not aware. So to go back to the beginning, kind of roundabout way. So if people vanish in unexplained circumstances, which people absolutely do, the dead bodies do too. So, does that explain these alleged disappearances of bodies out of the ground? Was there some kind of odd, if you like, force at work which was lifting these bodies out? If we went around checking graves today, would you find that a lot of bodies had disappeared? Who knows? But I do find that whole thing intriguing. That people vanish, and there was this panic about bodies vanishing in the 18th and 19th centuries. There's no connection between these two, really. It's just another aspect of the supernatural that has always intrigued me. And this is the question of witchcraft. For a long time, well, to go a little further back, there was a witch craze in the really 15th, 16th and into the 17th centuries, where a lot of people were accused of being witches and executed. And for a long time, the view was people were trying to be rational about it all. For a long time, there was the view that the witch craze, as it came to be called, was all a figment of people's imagination. There weren't the witches. Nobody really was a witch or practiced witchcraft. It was all pure fantasy. But then things began to change. And another view was adopted that, there were people who believed themselves to be witches, or to be in contact with Satan, or believed they could use certain powers to do things. I just looked one or two instances of this. James VI, King James VI of Scotland, of course. Was there a plot to kill him by witchcraft? Well, James came to believe there was, and because of what happened to him, he came to believe in witchcraft and witches. Eventually writing a book, quite a short book, and you can read it today, read it yourself, called Demonology. His Majesty King James I of England, but King James VI of Scotland. Basically, what happened was that a woman was arrested, Gilly Duncan. She was tortured, and in the confession that she made, she said that various people were witches, and she'd been actually involved. She'd been taught witchcraft by a number of people. One of the people she said she'd been taught witchcraft by was a man called James Fian, who actually worked for the Earl of Bothwell. And Bothwell was suspected of wanting to take over the kingdom and get rid of King James VI, even though they were actually related. Well, James, he didn't believe in witchcraft at this particular point. But he was interested in the accusations, and because this chap, Fian, worked for his cousin, the Earl of Bothwell, and Bothwell himself was suspected of being interested in the black arts, James thought he'd better, if you like, take a look into this. So he hauled this woman, Agnes Sampson, into court. Now, she had a reputation as a white witch, somebody who went around actually helping to cure people and basically doing good. But when he asked her what was going on, what was her involvement, she told him that there had been a plot to kill him. Why? We don't know. And she admitted she'd been part of it and named various other people. James didn't believe her. He said that's a lot of nonsense, or words to that effect. So she said, I'll prove it to you that I do have these strange powers. So she went up to him and she whispered into his ear the very words that he had spoken to his queen on their wedding night. And James was immediately convinced, because he said, how on earth could she have known what I said? Because I just whispered it and nobody else overheard it. So he was immediately convinced that there was a plot to kill him. And according to Agnes Sampson, what they had done, and this is where you kind of get this interaction then, that they had got a shirt that James owned, King James owned, because they knew somebody who worked in the house. They cut it up into strips, and then they put some poison on it with a magic ritual. And the idea was to put it next to James so that when he put his shirt back on, that he would absorb this magic right and poison into his body and die. Anyway, so James was convinced. And because he was convinced, he wrote this book, Demonology, to persuade people of the reality of witchcraft. But again, you know, there's a natural explanation for this. Was Agnes Sampson just a deluded person, or was there really a belief in the power of ritual magic and witchcraft? A maybe even more serious case involved Mary, Queen of Scots, who was the lady herself, who was accused of involvement of murdering her husband, Henry Darnley. Mary had come to detest Darnley because she thought him weak, even though she'd married him, obviously. She thought him a weak person, and he'd been responsible for murdering Rizzio, her secretary. Again, another famous incident. Darnley had definitely been involved in it because he was there when Rizzio was murdered. So the suspicion was that Mary wanted to get rid of Darnley and marry another Bothwell, not the James VI Bothwell, but another one. And she was accused of doing this by an act of black magic, which was slightly different from witchcraft because there was no suggestion that Mary, Queen of Scots, was a witch. But Darnley was found dead at a place called Kirker Hill, which was a building. Kirker Hill had been blown up, there was a massive explosion, and Darnley was found outside. But obviously he hadn't been in an explosion because it looked like he'd actually been murdered before the explosion took place. So there was a lot of suspicion. And Mary, Queen of Scots, was accused of involvement because it was suggested that she had been looking after Darnley. And again, she had got strips of cloth cut from her own lace and sewn it into a shirt, a night shirt of Darnley. So when, with a black magic ritual that she concocted from somebody else, some other black magicians that she knew, and that because of this, these strips and this magic ritual, that the idea was to kill Darnley. And that was the accusation against them. So, I mean, again, Darnley certainly had died before this explosion took place. So it's quite clear that he'd either been strangled, one suggestion, before the explosion, or that he'd been slowly killed by Mary, Queen of Scots herself. And again, what do you believe? Was she really using black magic to kill her husband, or was it simply an accusation thrown out? And just briefly again, right into the 1920s, when witchcraft certainly had lost its appeal, if you like. There's no talk of there being witches around, but instead it was replaced by the power of occult forces. And you had societies like the Golden Dawn, where people came together and thought they could actually, through magic ritual, create certain powers and influence people. And NORAH FARNARIO was a 30-year-old woman, her father was Italian. She lived down in Mortlake in London, and she had got herself entangled with some of these magicians. And supposedly, because she crossed them, she felt herself under psychic attack by them. So she disappeared off to the island of Mull. Stayed there for a couple of weeks. And she used to go every day. There's so when we've been to Mull, it's fairly flat in the centre. There was a special little hill, just a hump really, in the landscape, where she used to go and supposedly communicate with the spirits. Now, the thing is that this hillock, if you like, was a place where St. Columba used to go regularly to communicate with the, did I say well? Sorry, to communicate with angels. And people claim to see Columbus standing there and these angels coming down towards him. So NORAH FARNARIO was going to this very same hill. But one day she didn't return to the hotel she was staying in, lodging house Freewood. They went looking for her, didn't find her. 2 days later, they found a body on this hill. And as people said at the time, well, where had she been? Because, it was such an open bed, it was impossible not to have seen her body. But when they found her, she was lying there, there was a knife by her side, she was wearing some kind of occult necklace around her neck, and it was believed that she had, they said, committed suicide. But other people believed that she'd actually been involved in some kind of psychic battle with forces from beyond, and this is what had actually killed her. This struggle was those people she crossed who had occult powers greater than her own. Right, well, I will just move on to this. I think it's going to have to be the last bit now. Rudolf Hess and the Scottish occult. This is something, which has always fascinated me. This flight of Rudolf Hess to Scotland on 10th May 1941. An event which has aroused so much controversy, and so many books have been written about it, and it seems to be no nearer the truth than when it first occurred. There's Rudolf Hess himself in 1941, he was still Deputy Führer. He said he didn't have so much the same confidence that he one time had with Hitler, but there's no definite evidence to suggest that. He still seemed to be in regular touch with Hitler. He was his deputy, even a member of the Nazi party almost from the beginning. So he was, a well-established figure. Well, he crash landed. I'm going to go back a bit forward here a bit. He crash landed at this spot, Bonneton Farm, just outside Eaglesham. And just behind that little rise there, that's where the plane crashed. And that is the Messerschmitt, MEBF-110E, according to the technical experts, in which he was flying. And a stone was put there to mark the spot where he actually landed. The stone marks on the brave, heroic Rudolf Hess landed by parachute. The stone was smashed up by people who thought that it was wrong to commemorate what Hess had done, and didn't feel he was brave or heroic. But the question's never been solved is what was Rudolf Hess up to? Why did he fly here? Why did he fly to Scotland? And how did he manage it? A lot of the technical experts have spent, when I read a whole book, of people, somebody discussing whether it's technically possible to fly a plane, Messerschmitt, from Germany to Scotland in one go. I'm not going to enter into all that discussion because I'm not a technical expert. However, I'm interested in the possibility that there was an occult connection. There's been a lot of debate about the extent to which the Third Reich was interested in the supernatural. And there's been a lot of claims and, really exaggerated claims about the influence of the occult in Nazism. And I think this chap, Eric Kirklander, has absolutely established that certain leading figures of Nazism were definitely interested in the occult, and that the occult societies did play an important part in the founding and the development of the Nazi Party. And people like Rudolf Hess, the deputy Führer, and Heinrich Himmler, I'm sure you've heard about, were two of the people who took a real interest in the occult. And both Hess and Himmler recruited occultists, people interested in the occult, and what are called border scientists, people who didn't, if you like, do proper scientific study, were interested in various things on the fringe of science. They recruited these people to their organizations. So what do we mean by saying there was connections in Nazis and the occult? For one thing, they were interested in collecting mystical objects. They were interested in performing magic rites, which I'm sure you may be seeing Himmler in particular, set up particular special rooms with occult symbolism in them. They were interested in the mystical past. They believed in Atlantis, in the existence of Atlantis, and that there was a tradition, an Atlantean tradition, passed down through various generations and through various books. And as I've said, border science. And that's the spear which is supposed to have pierced Christ's side on the cross, supposedly kept in Vienna, which they were. And it was objects like this they were interested in gathering because they believed that they had mystical powers. So was Hess heading to ROSSLYN Chapel when he crash landed at Evesham? Why would he? Well, there was an organisation called the THULE Society, founded in 1918, believing in Atlantis. And in the 1930s, Hans Fuchs, a member of the THULE Society, visited ROSSLYN and gave a talk to the Edinburgh Theosophical Society. And in this talk, he claimed that Rudolf Hess knew about ROSSLYN Chapel because it was said that this is where the Holy Grail was kept. And this is one reason why he crash landed in Scotland, because the suggestion is he wasn't quite right in the head. So he was trying to get to ROSSLYN Chapel to get back this object, the Holy Grail, which is the most important of all the mystical objects. Right, I have come to the end, so sorry I'll wind up. I did have one or two other things I was going to talk about, but obviously I've gone on just a wee bit too long, so I'll have to keep those for another day. So, thank you. I hope some of that has been of interest to you. Thank you very much.